Hello everyone and welcome back for episode 5 of Painting a Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game miniatures. This season we're painting Bronn the Mercenary, Jaime the Prisoner, and Cersei Lannister, and in our previous episodes we've done most of the block coloring, so we're already on to starting to work towards those details to finish these guys off. In fact, as far as the actual season goes, we're over halfway there since I'm looking at about 9 episodes for this season altogether. For this episode in particular, though, we're going to be working on deepening the colors on Cersei's dress with a second coat of red, this time, as you can see, mixed with a little bit of magenta ink. After that, we'll be going on to starting the coloration for her base, which, as I mentioned in the previous episode, is going to be stony colored rather than the grassy mud that I do for all of my combat characters. And finally, we're going to start detailing the skin areas, putting our first skin tone highlight down. The skin is the only area that I expressly highlight when I'm painting miniatures because I want people's faces and the fleshy bits to really stand out and be interesting, draw the eye, because the eye is going to go to the face anyway. For now, though, I've taken some red and some magenta, and I'm mixing in a little bit of my airbrush flow improver to thin it out even further, and also help it because the flow improver serves a little bit like a thinner. It thins out the paint below it, or the ink below it. It'll help this second layer blend in a little better, and also take away some of that splotchiness that we got last time because I didn't mop up all of my red ink that much. This second step, where we're deepening the colors and working on them further, is why it's actually not that big a deal if you're not super neat with your very first layer of blocking in the colors. This second coat of color will help blend everything together as the wet layer added over top, potentially with some flow improver in it, thins out the lower layers and blends in with them, making everything sit much smoother. As for why we're adding magenta, well, it's because magenta has a little bit of blue in it, and while our standard red ink out of this P.H. Martin's set, it does not have all that much pigment to it. Basically, on our light gray primer, it ends up showing a little bit pink. By adding the magenta, which is thickened with that blue, that darker pigment, we can get a much thicker and richer red, which I thought was very appropriate for Cersei's dress. As for the actual painting process here, it's nothing too complicated. Just lay it on. In this case, be a little bit more careful about where it's pooling. If you see any pooling that looks particularly unnatural or looks like it's going to make the cloth not look like a fold, but rather just look like a strange splotchy mess, get another clean brush and just wick it away. As we do this, we'll be very thankful that we didn't start doing her base previously, like we started doing the bases for the other two, because otherwise this red is going to flow everywhere and ruin that a little bit. As it is, I'll leave you with the music as we finish up the dress here and come back when we do get around to the stony base after we've let this red set up for maybe a minute or two. Just make sure while you're doing this that you don't let the red seep over onto areas like her braid or her hands, which overlap the dress and are very small, so it'd be very easy for a thin liquid like this to flow onto them and smudge them a little bit. If you do smudge them, it's not the end of the world, particularly in the case of the hands, because we're about to be highlighting those and we can sort of just cover up any mistakes we make. Since we have some red in our palette and also a little bit of brown from the previous painting session, I'm going to mix those up to make a little bit of a dirty, just off fresh blood color, and spatter a little bit of that on Jaime's bandages. My recollection from the books and the TV show is that he wasn't receiving tip-top medical care after losing his hand, so we're going to illustrate that by making it seem that the wound is still maybe a little bit seepy. Generally, while that is a little gross, it should be a little accurate, and it definitely adds visual interest to the bandages themselves, which otherwise were just sort of a patch of gray, black, white going on, which is not particularly interesting. Once we've finished that up, give it just a couple of minutes for the red to set up on Cersei's base, take the opportunity to clean your palette, and we're going to go on to making a gray for the stone base. Of course, as I sort of alluded to in the previous episode, King's Landing in the Game of Thrones television show is actually filmed in Dubrovnik, which is in Croatia, and has sandier stone overall, so a sandy color wouldn't be a bad idea. However, I wanted to directly visually differentiate these from the sandy bases that I was going to be turning into grass for the other two. So I'm going with a more classic sort of old Irish or Welsh castle gray, like those decrepit castles that we see nowadays and immediately associate with fantasy. I'm going to be doing the same thing for all of my non-combat units of the A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game, although my actual approach to painting the stony base may be a little different as we go on, as I'm experimenting with other methods. In this case, I'm just starting with a really basic black and white, makes a middle gray, but I'm going to be trying some different things to dirty that up, detail it, and make it more visually interesting as we go on, because obviously this, just gray is not all that exciting. The one thing you're going to watch out for that I notice a little too late here and have to correct afterwards is that because I didn't let the actual dress itself set up, just the red on the base, before I was applying this gray, the moisture of the ink on the dress is actually going to start wicking up some of this gray paint into the folds of her dress near the base. This isn't a disaster, of course, if you catch it while it's still wet, and you can just kind of see it there while I turn my hand. If you catch it while it's still wet, you can wick it away or cover it up with a little more red ink. But obviously, if you let that set up, it would look quite odd. So here I am now. I'm just going to grab my clean brush, which I keep nearby for cleaning up mistakes at all times, and wick it away slowly. Make sure none of that wet gray gets up inside the creases and makes it look very odd. Go around and make sure you get all of that with your clean brush, and just keep wicking away at it. It's going to slowly soak a little more up over time, and you're going to have to fight it for a little while, as you can see here. Probably 30 seconds, maybe a minute at most. Watch out while you're doing this. I was fairly fortunate that it didn't actually ruin the red ink on the base of the dress and peel some of that away, having moistened it. But if it does, take the opportunity to put a little more red ink on once the gray is set up, so that the red ink doesn't flow down into the gray in turn. Having two areas next to each other like this that are wet paint can make for some interesting conundrums just like this. But be aware of them and work with them immediately, and almost everything is solvable with immediate action when working with paints or inks. What I'm noticing now is that the gray itself isn't getting great coverage over the base, or at the very least in the gloss of the light isn't looking like it's getting great coverage. Plus, it's not visually interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of brown, a little bit of yellow, and some of my gray, and just get a dirty sort of mossy color going, and I'm going to try and make patches of that across her base, hoping to break up just the flat gray aspect of it. This was sort of my attempt at seeing if I could get some sort of subtle cobblestone pattern going, but really it didn't pan out all that well. Applying it while the other paint is still wet means that they're blending together a little bit, and I'm getting a slightly more interesting gray, but I'm certainly not getting a noticeable pattern or anything that would actually be interesting to look at, or even really representative of cobblestone or stone in general, and it certainly wasn't what I was going to be happy with in my final product. I would like to note that while already the time it takes for me to paint up these miniatures, as you can see from the timestamps of all of the episodes by the time they come out, was only about 2.5 hours, and I did spend some time experimenting with a new concept for a base during that. So really, using inks to wash up a miniature, as opposed to having to go back and forth with letting washes dry and painting highlights and whatever, in my opinion, is actually a very quick way of doing the miniatures, and again, does make a very nice product in that short amount of time. Plug for my technique aside, I've now finished putting on that green, that mossy gray green that I wasn't so happy with. I'm going to set that aside and I'm going to let it dry this time so that I can work over top of dry paint in 5-10 minutes and start experimenting with different ways to make the base look interesting and stony. In the meantime, I'm going to take this opportunity to highlight the skin areas on all of our miniatures. This quick highlight that we're going to be doing is just my sort of semi-standard Caucasian skin mix, which is to say some yellow, some red, some brown, and some white. And I already have white on my palette, so it's a perfect time to do it. Mixing all of these together in varying proportions will give a sort of pale skin tone, albeit a little exaggerated and I think a little pinker than it should be, though I think that pinkness gives the skin a rich look at tabletop distance. I mix in some white, and I use acrylic in this case because the thickness of it is going to help us be a little more accurate in its application, to highlight specific areas of the face, as opposed to just washing the whole face and letting it soak in. What we're creating here isn't the highest highlight I'm going to be using either. This is sort of our mid-tone, so I'm trying to keep it middling between that brown that we've already applied to our miniatures' faces, and a slightly lighter color, which we'll be working off of this to make shortly thereafter in this same video. Using this mid-tone, we're going to be setting up basically the center of a 3-color spectrum on our miniatures' faces. In my opinion, 3 colors is about all you need, particularly in small areas like miniature faces, on small miniatures like this, to get an impression of a good fade or a good gradient between the 3 colors. Doing this everywhere obviously could give you a very nice result, but where you're trying to get the miniatures done on a Sunday morning so you can get more miniatures out, like we are here, and like you might be trying to do right now, just to turn out your first new board game or get your Song of Ice and Fire tabletop miniatures onto the table. Doing only 3 layers like this on the face, which is inherently a focal point of the miniature already, like I do, will give you a very good result and will already be eye-catching and pleasing to all those who are playing with your miniatures or looking at them later. Before you go onto the actual miniature, make sure you twist the brush like I just did to maintain the point on the brush itself. Otherwise, if you've been squiggling around your paint a little bit, you may end up with something that's a little fanned out or some stray brush bristles, which may put some paint in places you don't want. On a small area like these faces and hands, we can't really afford that. When I'm highlighting the faces, I really try to stick to a few specific areas, but this mid-tone I can get a little more crazy with. What I'm trying to do right now is I'm putting the mid-tone on all of the areas of the face except for the deepest crevices, where I'm letting that brown continue to show through. Those deep crevices will maintain a shaded look thanks to the brown, and because we used brown rather than, say, a black shade, we'll get a more natural looking shadowed effect. However, we go around with this mid-tone and just get all of the raised areas, get everything, and be fairly generous with this. In my previous season, I only used 1 color to highlight the skin areas, and so I was even more specific about where I was highlighting. That's what we'll do with our next increment, which we're doing in a couple minutes here. For now though, by adding a mid-tone, we're going to be a little bit more generous, because this isn't actually just the highest highlight or the brightest spots on the faces or hands. Do remember to get the hands, and try to remember to target raised areas on the hands as well. The hand, especially on Jaime, is pretty much the only other point of interest on him, and on Cersei is the only other spot breaking up her red dress. So in both cases, these are very useful areas to have paid some attention to, as they're going to be standout points in the design of the miniature. When doing the hands, particularly on Cersei here, who is extremely slender, be careful not to just smudge on your acrylic and get it into the gaps between the fingers. If you do this, you might have to go back later and rewash to get those very, very narrow areas to stand out again. Drawing the side of your brush along the fingers in the direction of the fingers can help by not pressing down and pulling across perpendicular to the cracks between the fingers. You may not press the tip of the brush into those cracks. Hopefully, you've managed to leave the creases between the fingers still bright, and we can move on to Cersei's exposed shoulders. For these, try and get all of the raised areas of all of the musculature, which is actually fairly nicely sculpted on her, leaving a bit of a gap for that brown shadow to show through between the shoulder blades and into any working areas around the collarbone as you work your way forward. Remember that shadow, that brown that we put on earlier, is going to be what almost forms the lines around other shapes, and when you're holding these miniatures at a tabletop distance, that's what's going to give real definition to the miniature itself as we work forward. For Cersei's face in particular, this three-tone painting technique I thought would be indispensable, because making her face look delicate but also detailed and also, interesting on a miniature with so few other defining factors was going to be key to making Cersei a fun miniature to look at and to play with, in my opinion. Once we finished laying in our midtone on all of the miniature's skin areas, we're just going to add some more white to the exact same color we were just using. That'll help tie the palette together and really make them look like they're just fading one into the other. Mix in enough white that you get a distinct difference between the two colors, not just a little bit of a faint difference, but a distinct difference when they're spread out next to each other on the palette. Going aside like I'm doing and just painting out a thin streak can give you a better idea of the color than that mixy swirly bit that you're blending it together in, where all of the colors mix and you don't get a great idea of the comparison. Keep in mind as you mix this up that acrylic paints, and this ink as well, tend to dry a little bit darker and deeper than they look when they're first applied. So even though in this case I've mixed something up that is much closer to white than necessarily I'd be looking for in the skin, that isn't going to be how it looks once it's applied, particularly not when framed by our midtone and our brown. So before going ahead to apply it, I noticed that Braun's face was fairly narrow and there wasn't much room to play around with it, so I decided not to do him first, but instead to do Jaime's, so I could just get warmed up and make sure my brush had a good point on it and the colors were looking good. Jaime has a little more area and also has hands to play with, so I went for that first, just so I could get a good feel for how this was going to lay in and if I wanted to change it before going on to Braun's much smaller face, framed by his beard. While applying it now, you can see I'm being much more delicate than I was with the midtone. I'm putting it on as dots on the tip of the nose, in the area that's exposed to the forehead, on the very tips of the cheekbones, and on the knuckles of the hand. This highlight is going to be much more stark than our midtone was, and is going to help to just pull out those extremely raised areas and make them look lit. It gives the skin a more lively appearance, and while you can do like I did in my previous season if you want to cut out another step and just use that midtone, particularly for miniatures like Cersei, where there isn't much going on, or really any of these miniatures where their color palette is somewhat limited, you may want to go the extra mile and just put in one more layer of highlight on all the skin areas to make them pop and stand out and just give some extra visual appeal to them. In Cersei's case as well, where she is a character who's been presumably in a castle for most of her life and fairly well treated, potentially even made up, not having good depth to her skin was, in my opinion, actually not appropriate for her as a character. As you go around here, she does have larger areas of skin exposed everywhere, so you won't be just putting on little dots like we did for those men with their big old beards in the way, but do try to keep in mind that this is just supposed to be the central area of any of your highlighted areas and the brightest. So leave a strip of the midtone between your highlight and the brown in the shadows. That'll help give that gradient effect and make this look a little more subtle than really it is, being just three colors on top of each other. Cersei's face in particular is quite delicate, and you don't want to make it look like it's too ham-fisted or like makeup is just caked on, but you do want to make sure that you've properly highlighted all of the areas of it, to make her look pale and to make her look noble, as I pointed out earlier. One area that's very hard to get to is her right cheek, framed between her nose and her braid and bangs. If you have a fine enough brush, obviously, try and highlight that as well. It'll make it pop a little more from the rest of the face. And I find if you don't get it, it does make the face look a little bit more lopsided than necessarily it should. I'm also going to take the opportunity before we finish up this session to just wipe away some of the extra red and make sure it's not pooling, using my clean dry brush off to the side. Once I approve of all of these, we're done for today, so thank you all for coming in. I hope you found this educational or entertaining or both, and I hope you are enjoying these videos so far. If you have any comments about what you'd like to see later, or any questions about what's going on in the video, or any comments for other viewers, throw them down in the comments section below. I hope these real-time episodes have been useful to you in following along the actual stroke-by-stroke painting process. I know I find these useful to watch when other people produce them, and so hopefully you are thinking the same thing. Until next time, go play some games.